On Theresa May's call for MI5 and the police to review their handling of the London terror attack. So, can the police and the security services be accused of dropping the ball in this case? Joined from central London by Hannah Stuart, who is the co-head of security and extremism at the Policy Exchange, and also Major General Chip Chapman, the former head of counter-terror at the Ministry of Defence, joining us from Wiltshire. Hannah, to you. First of all, your interpretation of what we've been seeing in an analysis in the newspapers of the last 24, 48 hours on what the government did and didn't know.
Well, what we know is that at least one of the attackers was known to the authorities, which is sadly becoming a recurring feature in terrorism cases. My research shows that 3/4 of people that have been convicted or have been involved in terrorism offences have been known to the authorities, whether that's the security services or the police. And in this case, one of the attackers was known to have been involved, we believe, with the prescribed organisation Al-Muhajirun, which is a particularly vocal organisation. Its members don't hide their views, and in this case the individual was even on a Channel 4 documentary talking about his views. So this is one that I think will have serious ramifications, in particular on how the security services categorise or prioritise the threats, because obviously with 23,000 people potentially being under surveillance, not full-time surveillance but being subjects of interest, they can't all be watched at all times, and so it's the process of who is the most, who potentially poses the most serious threat. And I think the review that's bound to happen after this will focus on where individuals who are associated with groups like Al-Muhajirun, where they sit in that hierarchy.
Okay. Chapman, he was known to be an active member of a banned group. The alarm bells should have been ringing, but have you heard anything at this stage that suggests a poor decision was made by the security services?
Sorry, was that to me, Kay? I've missed the first part.
Yes, it was, Chip, yeah.
Not really, and you have to be slightly careful here because, you know, Al-Muhajirun as a band prescribed, but they're not. They weren't a criminal organisation, and of course, hiding in plain sight as a rabble-rouser or a radicaliser, which was actually the title of one of the sessions I went to with a former Home Secretary, does not make you a criminal. So just having those really bad views, as for example Hizb ut-Tahrir have, which aren't a banned organisation, which are anti-Western and misogynistic, doesn't actually mean you should be locked up. Now we can change that sort of sphere of where you put the cursor in terms of criminal activities, but it wasn't criminal activity until he sort of crossed the line of departure to do this act. So you have to be quite careful on these things. Now, of course, there are 18 threats or 18 plots which that have been disrupted by MI5 and 5 in the last 9 weeks. And the management of the problem is the issue. There comes a time when the aggregation of the threat is likely to swamp the management of the problem. And that is where you get the real problem with finite resources.
Hannah?
Yes, I mean, I agree in the sense that certainly just exhibiting these views is not a crime. And I think the big question is, are we able to identify triggers or signs to show when somebody is, to alert the authorities to when somebody is moving from extremist views and as they manifest into terrorist action? And I think that's where the likely review will need to focus. And we do have some ideas. After the killing of Fusilier Lee Rigby, the security services reviewed their processes and thought again about subjects of interest that recurringly came up on the periphery of investigations. And they decided that they would try and sort of see these individuals in the round. And I think one of the things that we should also perhaps look at is when individuals have an immediate increase in contact with other known extremists and subjects of interest. Before again the attack on Lee Rigby, the perpetrators, there was a huge increase in their communication between one another. So that's possibly a trigger or a warning sign. These are the sorts of things that I'm sure the security services will now be looking at.
Yeah, Chip Chapman, his case had moved into the lower echelons, we're told, of an investigation. In other words, he dropped off the radar. What criteria changes do you think need to be adopted to try to stop that happening in future?
Well, of course, they do a reassessment and reevaluation. As I keep saying, they'll look at those algorithms, which in a sense was being alluded to by Hannah. But just to show you how difficult this is, if you take the bomber in Berlin, Amri, he was investigated 7 times by the German authorities on the scale of 1, that he was going to do an attack, and 8, an attack was unlikely. He met a 5, which was attack rather unlikely. So this is really, really difficult because The thing about the threat nowadays is that the process of moving from having radicalised views to executing attack can actually be very, very quick. And capability these days, as we've seen in Notre Dame this afternoon, can be as simple as a hammer.
Hannah, talk to us about some of the work that your organisation is doing about safe space within the internet that you're talking about.
Well, I think the idea of safe spaces for extremism and limiting them is something that that successive governments, actually, with the Prevent strategy, have realised that this is, as we've been saying, there are simply too many people to be watching at all times, and that we have to work further upstream to disrupt the dissemination of extremist messaging and propaganda, both in the real world, as, for example, extremist preachers are able to abuse, for example, university premises or publicly funded community centres, places like that, and also as this propaganda is now ubiquitous on the internet. So there's a lot of work needs to be done on squeezing the spaces in which extremists are able to operate, but while fundamentally also retaining freedom of speech and expression. And that's going to be, I think, particularly difficult in the online space. But there is work that can be done in terms of expanding, for example, the role of Ofcom, the broadcast regulator, to incorporate, so that really fundamentally social media companies and internet service providers are actually treated more like publishers. At the moment, I think it's too easy for them to say that they provide a landscape for people to talk to one another and share material, but they don't take responsibility as a way that publishers do for the content of that material.
Sadly, we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thanks a lot.